Nós vamos ouvir David Rodin. O David é pesquisador do Centro para Práticas Éticas de Oxford, atua nas áreas de filosofia moral e política. Suas pesquisas concentram-se em temas como guerra e conflito internacional, terrorismo e guerra assimétrica, tortura, ética nos negócios e justiça internacional. David, 35 minutes.
Thank you very much, Julita. Well, I'd like to start, first of all, by thanking the organizers of this wonderful conference. It's been terrific to be here. So I'd like to thank all of you, and I'd particularly like to thank Julita, who, in addition to being the chairperson of this panel, has taken on a kind of mothering role to the group of us non-Brazilians, providing ad hoc translation services, advice, and even travel advisory services. So thank you, Julita. Now, torture is a crime, but it's a crime of a very special nature, because it's a crime that in international law is reflected in an absolute prohibition. Well, what is an absolute prohibition? An absolute prohibition is simply one that allows of no justifying exceptions. Now, it's uncontroversial, I think, that the prohibition on torture is absolute in this sense. So, in the UN Convention Against Torture, for example, states that no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal political instability, or any other emergency, may be invoked as a justification for torture. And this language, this structure of prohibition, is echoed in many other regional and local jurisdictions, including, I believe, in Brazil's own constitution. So the prohibition on torture is absolute. But the fact that it's absolute is a puzzle. It's a paradox, if you like. It's a puzzle because it stands almost alone. Many other very important moral and legal prohibitions are not absolute in this way. Think, for example, of the prohibition against killing another human being, the right to life. There are several notable exceptions to that prohibition. The most apparent, of course, is the exception, the right of self-defense. The right to kill in self-defense. And it's a puzzle also because there are, as we are constantly reminded, situations in which observing the prohibition against torture may entail catastrophic moral losses. And here we've had a lot of discussion yesterday of the famous or infamous case of the ticking time bomb. So it's this puzzle, this paradox, that I want to try and address today. And I want to try and provide an explanation of how we can understand the prohibition on torture as being absolute, non-exceptional in this way. And the way that I'm going to do this is not by talking about the language of human rights. As important as I think human rights are, and as significant a contribution that they have made, particularly over the last 60 years, to the prevention and eradication of torture. But my focus in this talk is going to be on another aspect of moral concern. And the idea I'm going to develop was suggested by a quote from John McCain that was mentioned yesterday by one of the speakers. And what McCain said was, it's not about them so much as it's about us. Now, I think there's a sense in which, it's obviously and importantly about the victims of torture and what happens to torture. But there is an additional sense, a residual sense, that this debate has to do with us, with who we are as moral agents, with who we are and who we want to be as a society and as a political community. And what I'm going to suggest is that the reason that we can understand the prohibition on torture as absolute is that it reflects a very important communal value that we hold and are committed to together as a society, and that when we understand the role that this value plays in political relationships and in underlying the powers and responsibilities of agents of the state, police officers, interrogation officers, and so forth, we can understand how this absolute prohibition is justifiable and how it makes sense. So we are going to have something of a return to theory, and for that I do apologize in part. I apologize in part because it's obvious to anyone that philosophers and theorists are not going to solve the problem of torture. To do that, we need those of you, particularly in the audience, who are involved in the practice and administration of law enforcement agencies and interrogation, to apply the norms, both legal and moral, in your institutional work. But I don't make an apology for this reason. If we're going to believe, if we're going to make sense in the prohibition on torture as we find it in these legal documents, then we need to have an understanding of how this can be possible and how it can make sense. So then, the rejection of torture as a value or a virtue. Now, in the legal literature and in legal texts, the concept of torture is often linked to the complementary notions of cruel and unusual punishment, on the one hand, and to inhuman and degrading acts, on the other hand, of which, of course, torture is one example. Now, what I think is interesting about these terms is that cruel, inhuman, and degrading are also, in part, virtue terms. What I mean by that is that their evaluative content does not only point outwards, as it were, to the victims of these acts, it also points inwards to the subjects or perpetrators of these actions. So the point is not simply that torture is cruel to and degrades its victims. It is also that torture morally degrades the torturer, him or herself, by manifesting, in perhaps its purest form, the character vice of cruelty. When we say that torture is inhuman, we mean not only that torture treats its victims in a manner unbefitting of a human being, we mean also that the practice of torture is inconsistent with our best conception of what it is to be a human being, of worthy human character and human agency. Now, at this level, we're talking still at the level of individuals and individual virtue. But I want to suggest that in addition to ideas of individual virtue and values, there is also an important sense in which a collective, a community, may be committed to a particular value. And I want to suggest for the moment, I'll return later in the talk to whether this is actually true, but I want you to suggest at the moment that the absolute rejection of torture does function as a kind of shared collective value for our political community. So I want to assume that for the moment and see what follows from that. And at the end, I'm going to come back and talk about whether this is really the case. Now, one objection or worry about this talk, about values and virtues, is one that's been explored by several philosophers under the idea of dirty hands, and we had some discussion of this yesterday. And the worry here is to say, sure, values and virtues can be important things, but when one remains committed to a value or a virtue at the cost of very, very grave harm to others, admitting to this, continuing to hold to this value can cease to be a moral virtue, and it can in fact become a vice. It can become a vice because it's a failure to respond to the responsibilities of the world at large. And this charge, I think, has particular power in the context where there are explicit duties of care. So if you think, for example, about the relationship between a parent and their children, we might think about a parent who refused to take some action that could save their children because of a certain value commitment, perhaps a value of respecting the welfare of animals or whatever. We might think that while this value is admirable in itself, that there is a kind of morally problematic failure to respond to the emergency or the duty of care that's held there. And this idea, of course, has been very, very powerful and prominent among those who wish to justify torture. The idea simply is that politicians, governments, and agents of government, such as the police, are in the situation of a duty of care towards the population, somewhat similar to the duty of care of a parent towards their children. And that if they're in a position where they could save lives by dirtying their hands and engaging in torture, they ought to do it. Now, I think this idea is profoundly mistaken. And I think that the way that we can understand this is by investigating this idea that governments and agents of government have a responsibility towards the population at large. Because I believe that while this claim is true, police, agents of the state, and governments do have an obligation to the public at large. It's an obligation that is very complex, and it's an obligation that is not limitless, but has very specific limitations within it. And to see that, we are unfortunately going to have to make an excursion into the realm of political theory. Fortunately, however, Roy has already introduced some of the themes that I will be talking about. So what I'm going to do is to develop something of the themes that Roy has already introduced. Where do governments and the agents of government get their authority over us from? Well, in the old days, we used to believe that the authority of kings and of agents of the state was somehow inherent in their position. It was given by God or inherent in the position of a king, much in the way that we might believe that the rights of a parent are, in a sense, natural rights. But we no longer believe that. Today, we believe that the authorities and the rights of states and governments derive from the relationship that they have with the citizens of their state. It is we, the citizens of the state, that give authority to the government, and the government then delegates that authority through to its agents. Now, this relationship between the citizens and the government is, of course, what grounds, what explains the fact that governments have an obligation, a duty of care towards us. Because we only grant this authority to them on the condition that they use their powers and their authority in a responsible way, and primarily to maintain and protect our welfare. This is the fundamental form of the relationship that establishes our political community, what a philosopher would call the social contract. But that's not the end of the story. While we grant rights and authority to the government, and in return we expect them to use those powers to protect and maintain our welfare, there's an additional element to the story. Because communities can also be committed to certain kinds of value. And those values can frame and place constraints upon the authorities of governments. So take a simple example. We grant to the government the power to lock up criminals, and we expect them to use that power to maintain our welfare by protecting us from criminals. But we do not expect agents of the state to do whatever may take criminals out of circulation and protect our welfare. And the reason for that is that we're also committed to certain values, one of which is the value of justice and due process before the law. So in a situation in which a police officer may be able to take a criminal out of circulation by simply killing him in an extrajudicial way, We do not think that the police officer is obligated to do that. In fact, we think the police officer is obligated not to do that. And the reason for that is because of the underlying value that conditions and surrounds and limits the way that authority and power is generated within a political community. So the picture that I'm giving is somewhat more complex than the picture that Roy described in terms of Max Weber. The picture I'm giving is one of political authority, which is a complex mix of three elements. On the one hand, the government and the agents of government have a certain set of moral permissions to use the power and the apparatus of the state. That permission is conditioned by an obligation, a duty of care that they owe to us, and that duty is to use those powers in a way that secure and maximize our welfare. But it's also subject to a certain set of constraints, and that is to use those powers to maximize our welfare in a way that is consistent with our shared moral values and commitments. And one of those fundamental moral values and commitments, I want to say, is our commitment to the rejection of torture. So it's this relationship that explains why, in a ticking time bomb situation, a police officer or an interrogation officer is not obligated to torture a detainee, even if by doing so, he reasonably believes that he could save many lives. The reason he is not obligated to do so, and is indeed obligated not to do so, is that to do that would save lives only at the cost of violating a fundamental value of the community, and that it is precisely one of his jobs and functions to protect, reflect, and maintain those values. So that's the basic picture that I want to present. Now some specific objections. Somebody might say, well, look, I can see that communities have values and that these values act, as it were, as a kind of limitation on the powers and the obligations of officials of the state. But surely no one ever thinks that respecting values can be so important that we would allow people to die in order to protect those values. Well, the simple answer is that we certainly do. We do that all the time. I'll give you a simple example from my home country, Great Britain. In England, we have a lot of traffic congestion, as you have in Brazil. And sometimes there's a proposal made to create a large motorway around a town through an area of great natural beauty. And often there's a great debate between environmentalists and transport people. And very often in England, these debates end with the road project being cancelled because of a belief in the importance of these environmental and aesthetic values. Now, we know that by cancelling a big road project like that, certain people will die who otherwise would be saved. We know that motorways are much safer than small roads, so some people will die in road accidents who otherwise could have been saved. We know that motorways are much faster than small roads, so some people will not make it to hospital who otherwise would have. Now, I take it that this is an utterly mundane and banal example of what happens all the time in a political community. We think about our value commitments, we think about the available resources and trade-offs, and sometimes we take decisions that reflect values, even though we know that certain people will foreseeably die who we know could have been saved. Another trivial example, governments sometimes give money to support the research of philosophers like me, knowing that they could have given that money to put extra policemen on the streets, and knowing that had they done that, certain people would be saved from violent crimes. Perhaps certain people who will be murdered could have been saved. But this kind of trade-off, this kind of process of thinking about values that are important to us and making trade-offs is implicit in what it is to be a political life. And what these examples show is that we are willing often to accept preventable deaths for the purpose of values that are much more trivial than the value of rejecting terrorism. On the one hand, environmental and aesthetic values. On the other hand, values of supporting scholarship. How much more strong, then, should be the value commitment to a fundamental value such as the prohibition on torture? Well, you might say, okay, I agree to all of that, but is it really the case that we do have this basic shared value commitment to rejecting torture? How would we know? And even if we have it now, what if it changes sometime in the future? Well, I think there are a number of ways that we could look at the question of how we know whether a community is committed to a certain value or not. One way, clearly, is to look at opinion polls. Ask people. Now, when you look at what opinion polls say, the results are actually a little bit more encouraging than you might expect. The largest poll that I know of was conducted in the United States in 2005 by Gallup. And they found that a very solid majority, over 60% of respondents, would not condone the torturing of a detainee, even so-called torture light, in the form of waterboarding, even if the person detained was a terrorist, and even if it was believed that torturing him would yield intelligence that would save American lives. I find that rather encouraging. 3 years into the war on terror, after exposure to I don't know how many Jack Bauer incidents on 24, a very solid majority of Americans still had a commitment to not torturing, even in these extreme ticking time bomb situations. But I don't want to rest too much on that, because I think in a way that is a very superficial way of thinking about these values. Another form of evidence we might look at is we might say, let's look at the laws that the community has democratically passed through its democratic processes. And we can see that Brazil, like the United States and the United Kingdom, is a signatory of the UN Convention Against Torture that contains, as we saw, an absolute prohibition on torture. And we may look at other constitutional and legal documents as well that reflect an institutionalized legal commitment that has arisen from the democratic processes of our country that institutionalize this commitment to the rejection of torture. The third way, I think, that we can think about these kinds of shared collective values is by understanding a distinction between different ways that we can think about the idea of a value. So when we use the word value, we can use it in two different kinds of ways. In the first sense, when we talk about values and valuing, we can use it to simply talk about preferences that we have. We might change or might not have. So, for example, we might say, Mary values tidiness.
In her partner, right? It's a preference she happens to have, but she might not. She might choose to change it. She might not have it at all.
But there's a very different way in which we use the language of values. As, for example, when we say that freedom and democracy are values within our community. Now, what we mean by that is not that those are simply things that we happen to prefer. We prefer liberty and democracy. Other people prefer other things. What we mean is that those commitments are underscored by reasons. They're underscored by reasons, and that those commitments themselves function as reasons for other actions, decisions, and commitments within our community. So what's distinctive about this understanding of a value is that it is embedded within a structure of reasons, of justifications, for the way in which we think about what is and is not justifiable within our community. And here I think there has been some very important work done by legal philosophers that explain and demonstrate the way that the rejection of torture, the absolute prohibition of torture, functions as a reason embedded within a network of reasons in our political community. One body of work, which was discussed yesterday, was developed by the American political moral philosopher David Lubin. And Lubin's argument, I'll summarize briefly, is that the rejection of torture, the absolute rejection of torture, follows directly from the fundamental commitments within a liberal community to autonomy and dignity of human beings. If we believe in those fundamental human values, we are committed to, as a matter of logic, to rejecting the practice of torture. And that is so for the reasons that we discussed yesterday, because torture is the purest form of action in negation of those basic values of autonomy and dignity. So that's a picture of the way that the value of rejecting torture is, as it were, supported from below by these very basic foundational values within a liberal democratic community. Other work by the legal philosopher and fellow New Zealander Jeremy Waldron, now based in New York, approaches the problem from the other side, from above. What Waldron says is that the prohibition on torture has a very, very special function within legal rules and also within moral rules. It is what he says a legal archetype. Now, a legal archetype is a rule, a statute, a ruling that has a function that goes far beyond the immediate content of that rule or statute. It has a function in organizing, systematizing, and supporting a whole network of adjacent rules and laws. So examples that he gives are, for example, the habeas corpus law, the law that you cannot be detained beyond a certain period without being charged. Another example in States is Brown versus Board of Education, the seminal case that helped to overturn segregation in the United States. These are legal archetypes because, although in a way their content, what they actually say, is quite narrow, they act as a kind of beacon that helps to strengthen, systematize, and make sense of enormous areas of adjacent legal and moral thinking. So in other words, even though Brown versus Board of Education may not say anything specifically about segregation on buses or equal right to voting, it acts as a kind of emblem that helps us to understand and uphold these areas of law. And precisely the same is true, argues Waldron, with the prohibition on torture. It acts as a legal archetype, helping to explain, sustain, and maintain adjacent areas of law, such as, for example, law prohibiting police brutality, and many, many other areas of law maintaining human dignity. And that to weaken or reject or undermine legal archetypes risks affecting not only that very specific area covered by this law, but a whole area of adjacent legal and moral principles. So with these arguments, what I think we can see is the way in which the value commitment of rejecting torture, the absolute prohibition of torture, functions as a kind of pivotal element in a whole network of moral, legal reasons and beliefs. It is sustained from below by our basic commitments to liberal values of autonomy and dignity, and in turn, it sustains a whole area of basic principles, rights, and protections that are not specifically to do with torture, but that are nonetheless sustained and maintained by this legal archetype. Now, I want to begin to wrap up by answering a question that was put to the panel very forcefully yesterday. And that question was, if there was ever a ticking time bomb situation, what would you do? I think it's important to answer that question. And I think that for somebody who believes in the absolute prohibition of torture, there is actually a very, very simple answer to be given. The first thing to realize is that in a situation like that, if it were my family or my children on the line, the simple answer is you could probably get me to do pretty much anything. You could probably get me to commit the most heinous acts of abuse and torture. But what does that tell us about the permissibility of torture? The answer is it tells us absolutely nothing. What it tells us about is about what you can get somebody to do under a situation of duress. It tells us about the psychology of action under situations of extreme terror. But it tells us nothing about moral justifiability or the shape of an appropriate legal framework. It is, in fact, precisely the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask is what set of legal and moral laws I would want to be judging me and operating on me if I were ever to be in that situation, and knowing that there is a non-zero chance that my family, my children, or myself might in fact be on the line in this situation. In other words, the appropriate question to ask is not the question, what would we do in the situation? But what are the laws and what are the rules that we would want to put in place now, thinking reflectively about the situation at a time in the future? Just to sum up, I want to say a few words about the relationship between torture and terrorism. The argument that I've given is not specific in any way to the global war on terrorism. It's an attempt to provide an explanation of the absolute prohibition on torture in contexts where maintaining that prohibition could have significant costs, such as in the ticking time bomb situation. And that argument has as much relevance to torture in the police context as it does in the counterterrorism context. But I want to say a few words about the counterterrorism context, because the idea of values also plays a very significant role in that debate. One of the motifs of the Bush administration, and also to a lesser extent the Blair administration in Britain, has been that terrorism constitutes a threat to our values. Right? Not only to our persons, but to our values. Now, there's one sense in which I think this idea is just truly meaningless. It seems to me an example of what a philosopher would call a category mistake. Right? A value is not a physical object. It is an intangible thing that exists within the hearts and minds of persons and communities. It's not the kind of thing that can be threatened by bombs and guns and explosives. But there's another sense in which this idea is absolutely right. This idea that terrorism functions as a threat to our value. And that is in the temptation that terrorism provides to engage in a kind of self-mutilation of our own values. Because at the end of the day, it is only we ourselves that can destroy, weaken, marginalize, or supersede our own values. And I think that the lesson for us really has to be that this is a temptation, a very, very strong temptation provided by acts of terrorism, that we must find the courage to reject and avoid. Thank you.